hearing. Each of you has experienced firsthand the impact of PFAS exposure and unfortunately suffered the consequences of federal delays and incessant inaction to address this crisis. There's no question that PFAS has caused irreparable damages to the health and well-being of our communities for many years, and government must take decisive action so that families and communities don't have to endure the struggle for decades more. We've waited far too long already for decisive action. The second panel before us here today features both current and former Michigan residents that will speak to their experiences and provide critical suggestions on how the federal government can best work with the state of Michigan and local communities on removal, treatment, and destruction methods for PFAS substances, as well as efforts to transition to a potentially and hopefully safer alternatives. While the federal government must take greater measures to address this crisis, we're lucky that Michigan is home to one of the most successful PFAS responses in the nation, the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, which I believe can serve as a model for the rest of the nation. We're also lucky to have a powerful network of advocates who are willing to work together to raise awareness and push for substantive solutions to address PFAS contamination. So again, thanks for each of you to be here, taking time out of your day, and we anxiously await your testimony, an important part of the record that we need as we take action on this crisis. It's the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses. So if you would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony that you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. You may be seated. Our first witness on this panel is Ms. Abigail Hendershot, Executive Director of the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. Ms. Hendershot is a 30-year veteran of the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, and she has led a team responsible for Michigan's largest PFAS contamination response to date. Welcome to the committee, and you're now recognized for your opening comments.
Thank you, Chairman Peters. Let's try this again. Thank you, Chairman Peters, for inviting Michigan to provide testimony regarding the ongoing work of our Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, or MPART, to address per and polyfluoroalkyl substances issues across our state. I will acknowledge that I am also a Rockford citizen and a graduate of MSU, so go green. As you said, my name is Abigail Hendershot. I am the Executive Director for MPART, and I'm pleased to share with you the Michigan perspective on the need for a more coordinated federal response to PFAS contamination and explore the interagency and intergovernmental policy solutions that holistically address PFAS risk, remediation, and research. The Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, initially created in 2017, was established as an enduring body in February 4th of 2019 by Governor Gretchen Whitmer to address the threat of PFAS contamination in Michigan, protect public health, and ensure the safety of Michigan's land, air, water, while facilitating interagency coordination, increasing transparency, and requiring clear standards to ensure accountability. Since 2017, MPART has solidified its role as a national leader in identifying and addressing PFAS contamination by the coordinated activities of 7 different state agencies. This coordination and collaboration have allowed Michigan to effectively leverage the actions of all the agencies to swiftly identify and respond to PFAS in our communities. These departments include the Departments of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, Department of Natural Resources, Transportation, Agriculture and Rural Development, Health and Human Services, the State Fire Marshal, and Military and Veterans Affairs, all of which who have staff dedicated to continuously address PFAS issues. MPART is encouraged by the actions laid out in the EPA PFAS strategic roadmap and the goals for coordinated and cooperative cross-agency efforts to develop and improve tools to address PFAS, as announced by the Biden administration in October of 21. However, more can and must be done to coordinate and collaborate on the tough issues that PFAS presents to not only our nation, but to the world. Let me give you an example of how MPART strategic coordination has benefited the citizens of our state. Starting in 2018, Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy conducted pioneering work to trace PFAS in wastewater back to industrial facilities. At one location, these results led to the halt of land application of heavily impacted biosolids on farmland. Sampling efforts revealed that crops and cattle on the farm had been impacted by the industrial contaminated PFAS-containing biosolids. Determining the next steps at the farm required thoughtful collaboration with state DNR, Department of Agriculture, and Department of Health and Human Services. The federal government's lack of a unified approach and standards meant that Michigan could not obtain written guidance or advice from our federal agencies regarding acceptable levels of PFAS in beef, resulting in Michigan conducting its own public health evaluation and risk determination. Similar situations in Maine and New Mexico highlight the need for national research and standards for food and crops and for enhanced federal coordination to provide clarity and assistance for our farmers in our states. In fact, there are still many PFAS issues that would benefit from coordinated efforts at the federal level, such as food testing and standards for PFAS in the food supply, further study and better understanding of the transport and deposition of airborne PFAS, continued research to find effective fluorine-free replacements for firefighting foams, collaboration and research to advance our toxicological understanding of PFAS and the human health effects, and better public notification and transparency so that our citizens can be better informed about PFAS risks. An important piece of the collaborative MPART model is our Citizens Advisory Work Group, also known as the COG, which make up of residents from around the state who have been directly or indirectly affected by PFAS in their communities. The COG allows our citizens to have a way to directly provide input to MPART on PFAS topics. Their voices have reinforced the MPART mission to collaborate among the departments and be transparent in our efforts. The COG has also stressed the importance of notifying the public when PFAS has been found in communities, especially for residential drinking water well owners who may be potentially at risk. MPART has collaborated with the COG and several agencies to develop successful measures to inform the public in Michigan. Nationally, a toolbox of potential notification protocols would be helpful for other states. Being able to share that data with the public would help communicate PFAS information nationally, and federal agencies should work together to share their data and provide consistent messaging about PFAS so that people can make sound decisions as to how to reduce the risk for themselves and their families. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss Michigan's leadership on the cutting edge of PFAS mitigation policy at the state level and to discuss the need for a national MPART-like structure of collaboration and coordination moving forward. I welcome hearing from the other witnesses today and look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hendershot. Thank you for your testimony, and also welcome back to campus. We've got a real trend going here. A lot of folks on these panels know this place very well. Good to see you. Our next witness is Ms. Brianna Knudsen, the Tribal Environmental Response Program Specialist for the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan. Previously, she served as Brownfield Specialist for the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians. Ms. Knudsen, welcome to the committee, and you may proceed with your opening remarks.
Mnokajib, Senator, Chairman Peters, for inviting us today. My name is Brianna Knudsen. I'm the Environmental Response Program Specialist for the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan, speaking today on behalf of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan. The tribe is appreciative of the opportunity to testify at this field hearing, and we are nominated to do so by the United Tribes of Michigan. Historically, the Saginaw Indian Chippewa tribe lived primarily in the eastern region of what is now Michigan. Between 1795 and 1864, a total of 16 treaties were made between the U.S. government and the tribe. The main ceded territories of the tribe were designated specifically in the treaties of 1855 and 1864, which also established the Isabella Reservation. Over 130,000 acres were allotted to the reservation. The tribe also maintained a second satellite reservation area in Standish and owns additional properties in Aranac and Iosco counties. Within the Isabella Reservation of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan, there are 3 sites, 2 defunct landfills, and an old refinery known to be sources of PFAS contamination. Within ceded territory boundaries, there is the Wurtsmith Air Force Base, a known source of PFAS contamination as well. In Clark's Marsh, near that air base, previous testing for PFAS revealed extremely high levels of PFAS in the tissues of fish caught in that marsh. CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 2002, provides to tribal nations the rights to enforce cleanup and remediation of contamination on tribal lands. However, the tribe cannot pursue cleanup actions in these sites until the federal government officially classifies PFAS as regulated hazardous substances under CERCLA designation. Without this classification, there can be no cleanup standards created to achieve and enforce, and without cleanup standards to achieve and enforce, there can be no legal instrument to hold responsible parties liable for contamination by remediating and restoring these sites. Thus, to clean up PFAS from their lands, the hands of the tribe are tied without official classification of PFAS as regulated hazardous substances under CERCLA. So I'm glad to hear that that is soon coming. It must be noted that statements made by the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan do not and should not be construed as representative of the other 11 federally recognized tribes in Michigan. The tribe has previously facilitated intertribal and interagency efforts to address PFAS issues in Michigan and looks forward to continued cooperation to resolve PFAS contamination on tribal lands. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Newton. Our next witness is Dr. Cheryl Murphy, a professor in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife and the director for the Center of PFAS Research at Michigan State University. Dr. Murphy was recently awarded a $1.9 million grant from the Department of Defense to develop a toxicity testing framework for PFAS mixtures and assess the risk that PFAS poses to animals. Dr. Murphy, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peters, and thank you very much for this opportunity to submit testimony related to improving interagency and intergovernmental coordination on PFAS for Michigan communities, which is a really timely and important issue. My name is Cheryl Murphy, and I am professor in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State University and an ecotoxicologist. But I also serve as director, like a real privilege to work with a lot of really talented people at the MSU Center for PFAS Research. For several decades, these PFAS compounds have infiltrated and accumulated in our drinking water ecosystems, our atmosphere and food supplies, and despite this, they're still being manufactured in lots of different ways and used for many different processes. There are more than 5,000 of these man-made chemicals that are really resistant to degradation. They remain in the environment and organisms for many years. We know PFAS and PFOA are two of the most commonly produced PFAS compounds that have toxic effects, and they bioaccumulate in organisms, but we know very little about the rest. I provide much more background in my written testimony, and there was just this recent GAO Government Accountability Report on July 28th called Persistent Chemicals, Technologies for PFAS Assessment, Detection, and Treatment that details a lot of these issues. Because this PFAS issue is not only pervasive in Michigan communities, but also throughout the US and the world, and is a problem that affects multiple aspects of our daily lives, we at MSU, in the true spirit of the first land-grant institution, sought to determine how we could respond to this emerging crisis. We quickly realized that effective research solutions could only come from this very multidisciplinary focus. In some ways, we followed the model performed by the state of Michigan in forming MPART, but we also thought a center would make it easier to coordinate with them, as well with our federal agencies, our international partners, and to liaison with communities and to engage with industry on safer replacements. Coordination would also avoid duplication and more efficient progress towards solutions. We formed our center to unite several colleges and schools to attract other researchers with much needed skills that have not been focused on PFAS yet, ranging from social scientists to engineers. And while we've been successful at acquiring specific research grants from federal agencies, Senator Peters mentioned the DoD is one, we found that there seems to be no funding mechanism that would provide larger overall support for initiative as broad and as comprehensive as the one is required to address the PFAS problem and to address it quickly. Much of the research has been on drinking water, which is really important. I'm not saying that, but it's also in our food supplies and our natural resources, and we can't measure most of them and we don't know their toxicity. Interagency coordination would be of considerable benefit and help broader center initiatives that will allow for things like cohesive data collection and storage and sharing, and an efficient investment into infrastructure needs, such as equipment and facilities that could be used by many researchers. For example, we're finding contaminated farms, livestock, and fish, but we do not have facilities specifically built that could assist in determining how the chemicals accumulate, their toxic properties. We need these to develop mitigation strategies so that we don't consume more PFAS and provide immediate solutions to farmers and fishermen and our communities. We also need to invest in technology to be able to measure these chemicals quickly in all sorts of different matrices. And we need to develop high throughput toxicity assessment platforms and other tools that can be used for PFAS and are validated for risk assessment. Land-grant institutions would be ideal places to host such research centers because of the breadth of expertise and the focus on solutions related to food systems, natural resources, and agriculture, and our outreach and extension into our communities. This investment would help us train the next generation of scientists and engineers so that they're prepared to tackle these issues and solve these problems for future generations. So in summary, a larger investment from coordinated federal agencies would enable the development of a number of focused research hubs across the US that would contribute to solving key problems. We feel that the time to deal with these compounds as isolated and independent cases is long past, and we need to change our focus from more from delegating the responsibilities to single agencies and specific researchers to more collaborative, united collectives of vastly different but complementary disciplines to prioritize needs, focus on the rapid development of solutions to these problems. This initiative should be led by the federal government so that we do not duplicate efforts, develop appropriate infrastructure, and can respond quickly to the emergency issues like contaminated food supplies and impacts on our communities. And so thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Dr. Murphy. Thank you for your testimony here today. Our next witness is Lieutenant Colonel Craig Miner. Colonel Miner is a retired Air Force officer who used to serve at Wurtsmith Air Force Base. He and his family's exposure to PFAS chemicals during his service on base has unfortunately led to some significant health challenges. His family was cast in the, quote, No Defense documentary, and he is the co-author of Overwhelmed, a civilian casualty of Cold War poison. Colonel Miner, pleasure to have you here. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Chairman Peters, for this opportunity, and my family thanks you, and veterans from Wurtsmith and their families thank you as well. We're here because we know PFAS is harmful to people. In fact, people are the #1 reason we care about PFAS at all. We want our ground and surface water cleaned up because we do not want people to drink, eat, touch, or breathe this poison. The priority is clear: people. No agency or person would support a one-sided PFAS strategy that states or implies we ignore past harms and only focus on preventing future harms. My testimony today is to highlight a significant past harm which requires your immediate leadership. From 1982 to 1997, Wurtsmith Air Force Base citizens drank egregious amounts of PFAS in the tap water daily and for 10 years. Beginning in 1982, Wurtsmith firefighters began to routinely dispose of PFAS-laden AFFF along the grassy edge of the operational apron near the fire station. The AFFF dump site was only 500 yards upstream in the aquifer from the main drinking water wells. Dumping AFFF on the ground was never an approved disposal practice. A 1982 3M product environmental data sheet clearly states disposal of product lead to a wastewater treatment system in accordance with local regulations. Because of the known toxicity of AFFF, Air Force and Navy research documents from this period stated the same. Had excess firefighter foam been disposed of in a wastewater treatment facility and not dumped on the ground, I would not be testifying in front of you today. When Wurtsmith military operations ended in 1993, base officials labeled the operational AFFF dump site SS-60. According to Air Force documents, the practice of dumping AFFF at site SS-60 ended in 1992. For 10 years, from 1982 to 1992, AFFF with PFAS was dumped directly on the ground, entered the groundwater, and was drawn into the main water well supplying all Wurtsmith potable water via the water tower. After 1992 until 1997, smaller amounts of PFAS-laden water continued to enter the base water system from the PFAS-saturated aquifer. And in 1997, the local municipal water system was replaced and replaced those wells. The amount of PFAS entering the wells was not trivial. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, of course, we know them as EGLE today, would discover 25 years later that the PFAS concentrations in the groundwater at site SS60 were over 43,000 parts per trillion. Further, MDEQ measured high PFAS concentrations from SS60 stretching to the historical water wells. The MDEQ also discovered trapped water in 22 abandoned fire hydrants, a hot water heater, and water softener from when Wordsmith was active. As expected, all trapped water, contained various concentrations of PFAS, and the highest concentration was roughly 7,500 parts per trillion. My wife, Carrie, and I worked and lived on base from 1985 to 1990. In October 1989, our son Mitchell was born at Wordsmith with severe cerebral palsy and microcephaly. And he passed 30 years later, 2 weeks after filming his story in the No Defense documentary. In 1989, I was hospitalized on base for an unidentifiable prostate issue. In addition, I had a large tumor removed from my back. 2 years after our profoundly handicapped son was born, Carrie miscarried our next child. We did not discover PFAS was in the Wordsmith water until 2019, 2 weeks after God prompted us to write Overwhelmed, which added a civilian casualty of Cold War poison. Go to mitchellsmemoir.com to learn more. In 2019, my overall PFAS levels were 3.5 times higher than the national average, and my perfluorohexane sulfonate levels, a signature component of AFFF, was nearly 20 times higher than national exposure levels. Today, my liver and spleen are enlarged, and my kidneys are low functioning. And this is just the beginning of the list. I have met another veteran with similar blood results and health issues. It is now 40 years since Wordsmith citizens began drinking PFAS from AFFF in egregious amounts. And it is time for local, state, and federal leadership to officially recognize this event. To start, governments and applicable agencies need to cut through the red tape and add this poisoning event to the VA presumptive list until Congress can organize a more comprehensive solution to care for all the U.S. citizens that were poisoned. The DoD should be the loudest voice, taking lead to triage its Cold War battlefield casualties. Why DoD? Because we leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Munner. Thank you for sharing intensely personal story as well. Our final witness is Ms. Kathy Westerbarth, founder of Need Our Water and Oscoda Citizens for Clean Water. Through her work, she serves as a reliable resource and catalyst for education and for communication while advocating for long-term health and environmental welfare plans on behalf of those impacted by the water contamination from the former Wordsmith Air Force Base in Oscoda, Michigan. Ms. Westerbarth, thank you so much for being here, and you may proceed with your opening comments.
Chairman Peters, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I am Kathy Westerbarth, a founder of Need Our Water, Oscoda Citizens for Clean Water, a community leader with Great Lakes PFAS Action Network, and a member of our local Restoration Advisory Board. I'm a registered dietitian, clean water advocate, and a native of my beloved town of Oscoda, Michigan. I was a competitive swimmer and a young lifeguard on the U.S. Air Force Base beach, which we now know is highly contaminated with PFAS. Little did I know that the cancer and immunological disease I developed a few years later in my 20s may have been due to the drinking water and lake water exposure from performing that lifeguarding job as a civilian employee for the U.S. Air Force. To this day, I continue to battle these diseases, much like my mother, my father, and both sisters who have lifetime illnesses potentially associated with their PFAS exposure. Unfortunately, our family in Oscoda is not unique. Military personnel, their families, and our neighbors are reporting the same conditions. Sadly, some cases have led to preventable death. I am proud to be part of a community that supported the former Wordsmith Air Force Base functions and continue to be proud of the mission of the Department of Defense to provide combat credible military forces needed to deter war and protect the security of our nation. However, at the same time as providing these important services to our national security, toxic PFAS has been flowing essentially uninterrupted for decades from the former Wordsmith Air Force Base through the groundwater. This toxic PFAS contamination is bleeding into nearby Benetton Lake, Clark's Marsh, and the El Sabo River, all of which carry that toxic water to the drinking water source for hundreds of thousands of people in the Great Lakes region. In 2015 and 16, testing of the Lake Huron municipal water system revealed 4.2 parts per trillion average of PFAS and PFOS combined for the sampling. We have had health advisories throughout our community due to this uncontrolled spread of PFAS, including foam, fish, venison, and all animals living in Clark's Marsh, which used to be a popular fishing and hunting destination, is still used by substantive hunters and anglers to gather their food. Because it is odorless, colorless, and tasteless, we unknowingly were subjected to these toxic PFAS chemicals for decades and continue to be exposed for decades after PFAS manufacturers and the military knew PFAS chemicals were harmful to human health. Shockingly, we now have that visual evidence in the PFAS-laden foam forming on our waterways and Lake Huron. After over a decade of knowing PFAS chemicals were impacting our health and community, the past exposure we experienced still has no comprehensive corrective measure. We must live the best we can with the harm caused and must do so while enduring a lack of transparency, accountability, and collaboration from the Air Force and the Department of Defense as part of the cleanup process. Through Need Our Water's continued partnership with the Wordsmith site experts, some of whom are here today, the National Wildlife Federation, community members, and Wordsmith veterans, such as Craig, I was involved with creating a document that summarizes the timeline of PFAS exposure and actions at Wordsmith. Starting in the 1970s, it details the DoD actions that are inconsistent with the known severity of the problem, false promises, and endless delays. This well-researched, clearly detailed, and thoughtful document was submitted by me at the September 2021 Restoration Advisory Board meeting. During the meeting, when I asked for a formal response to this document, the U.S. Air Force leadership asked me why I would want a response to a public document. As part of my testimony, I will submit this document for the committee to review. This incident is an example of the shift that needs to occur in the U.S. Air Force and the DoD approach. Communities have vital information to provide, and we should not be dismissed when it is presented. Through my advocacy, I've learned to study the actions of those doing this work before me, such as the late author of Silent Spring, Rachel Carson. She said, which ironically could be posed to the DoD in literal terms today, man's attitude towards nature is critically important simply because we now have acquired a fateful power to alter and destroy nature. But man is part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. We're challenged as mankind has never been challenged before to prove our maturity and our mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Worcester-Berth. Thank you for the personal story, and the document that you referenced will be entered into the official record of the committee. Ms. Hendershot, at the state level, Michigan clearly has focused on improving in interagency collaboration on PFAS to get a kind of robust and coordinated response to the crisis. If you could explain to the committee and describe lessons that you have learned in this approach and how the federal government can use this as a model and how we can effectively address PFAS around the country.
That's a great question. So I think the biggest thing that we have learned is that there's not one agency that can truly unravel and solve the complex PFAS issues that present themselves. It takes the entire team. It requires a team approach. It requires an agency approach, and it requires some strategy. So all of these different agencies, whether at the federal level or state level, all have different authorities and different regulatory policies that have to be meshed together to be able to provide strategic responses. And that strategic plan has to be holistic. It has to be comprehensive to be able to adequately protect public health, promote ways to inform and educate our public, as well as actually provide effective communication. The MPART collaboration structure really works, though, because of the authority given to the team by the governor for the state of Michigan. So that response and executive directive actually, or just executive order actually gives us the authority then to require coordination and collaboration by all of our departments with a frequency that gives us a unified and streamlined approach. It doesn't come easily. And it's many, many hours of hard work by our department staff, but you can see the efforts that it pays off for our citizens when we do this. I think the other thing that I would say is that when we're working through PFAS issues, whether it's sampling municipal drinking water or working through site-specific projects like Wordsmith or Wolverine, sampling surface water and fish, all of these point to the need for constant communication. The information, as you heard from the previous panel, is changing so rapidly. There's so much research going on that it's very important to be able to stay in constant communication and sharing of information and the research. And so I think that's the biggest lesson learned, is that collaboration has to be done quickly, constantly, and effectively to ensure that the public has really good sound messaging, because it can be very convoluted very quickly if we don't apply a unified approach.
All right. Thank you for that. Ms. Knudsen, could you speak to the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribes experience working directly with the federal government to keep your community safe from PFAS contamination?
Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan, we have had effective support from the state of Michigan and our Eagle partners in addressing our PFAS issues, such as assistance with testing of fish tissues and river areas. Eagle consistently invites the tribe to participate meaningfully in relevant PFAS discussions, planning, and remedial action planning. Eagle and the state of Michigan have created PFAS cleanup standards to enforce, and thus are an actionable partner. The federal government, we don't have any PFAS cleanup standards to work with until the federal government classifies PFAS as regulated hazardous substances under CERCLA. The tribe was ultimately limited in our ability to partner with the federal government to address these PFAS issues on our tribal lands.
Have you reached out to the EPA or any agency just for some advice and counsel, or you don't have any dealings with them at all?
Well, we do work with the EPA with many of our grant programs, including the grant that I work under, R128A CERCLA grant.
Right.
So EPA is a very good partner with us. Just in this particular issue, we can't really do much without those cleanup standards to enforce.
Great. Senator Schott, if you could also, you've given some examples in your previous question, but kind of some examples of proactive state level leadership in Michigan that the federal government specifically might be able to emulate and devise some more effective policies. What recommendations would you give?
So when it comes to proactive federal, I think, obviously, as Ms. Knudsen said, state or having actual federal standards is the first step. The approach that the federal government needs to be able to take has got to start with a regulatory approach that has authority. So starting with the MCLs, as Mr. Piggott said, starting with the MCLs is a vital, crucial piece to starting that process. working down to a CERCLA designation for PFOS and PFOA will be a next step. But there's many, many other steps and pieces that require the different programs to have regulatory authority. I think that's going to be the first piece that we would like to see from EPA, and that their leadership is going to be necessary for. As far as other federal regulatory programs, there's many, many other ones that we intersect with, whether it comes from USDA for food testing, FDA for additional food testing, US Fish and Wildlife, et cetera, et cetera. There's many different agencies that have authorities that we would like to be able to get their advice for the technical expertise and for the research that they're doing on PFAS, because there is a lot of research going on for PFAS, but the states don't always have the resources to be able to do that kind of research ourselves. But at least in Michigan, we do have our own authority for regulations.
Mhm. So Michigan has their own authorities. We're waiting for the EPA to set standards, which we talked about in the previous panel, but we do have a health advisory that's out. Do you see anything changing or the landscape changing anyway with that advisory, or do we have to wait for the standard to come out?
I think that we're going to learn quite a bit from the EPA's health advisory. In Michigan, we will continue to use our enforceable standards until EPA has their MCLs that become officially promulgated. But I think it's more than that, having ATSDR at the table and being able to look at the science that they're reviewing, understanding the inputs, the toxicological assumptions, the endpoints, all of that's really important to our Department of Health and Human Services as they take a second look at what we're looking at for our state. In this point, we will continue to use our enforceable standards until EPA actually sets those drinking water standards, and that they don't become just an interim health advisory, but actually become an enforceable maximum contaminant level that we can actually use.
Right. Good. Thank you. Ms. Knudsen, certainly PFAS contamination impacts all communities, but are there some unique impacts in the indigenous community here in Michigan?
Yes, every indigenous community here is unique. And again, Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe cannot speak for the 11 other federally recognized tribes in Michigan. Specific to us though, PFAS contamination prevents the full exercise of our hunting, gathering, and fishing rights as designated in those 16 treaties with the federal government. There are now various PFAS consumption advisories for fish caught in water bodies near our reservations and in our ceded territories, including bluegills, sunfish, smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, caught in the Saginaw River and Saginaw Bay areas. There have also been PFAS consumption advisories for other wildlife, including for deer within 5 miles of the Wirt Smith Air Base. Thus, the tribe's rights to sustenance, fishing, gathering, and hunting in ceded territory areas as were given in the treaties are being impeded by PFAS contamination and its subsequent bioaccumulation in wildlife.
You mentioned the different advisories. I know the rainbow smelt up in Lake Superior recently was put on advisory. So do you believe you're getting adequate support from either the state or the federal government to address these concerns with wildlife and your hunting, or your abilities to hunt and to fish? And what more could we do?
Saginaw Chippewa has previously hosted PFAS listening sessions in the fall of 2018. All levels of stakeholders were invited, including EPA Water Division staff, EPA staff from Region 5 and headquarters, EGLE, MDHHS, the Area District Health Department, and local municipalities. These communications have thus far been effective. Again, without that CERCLA designation of those hazardous substances for PFAS on our trust lands, we're unable to further our efforts to remediate those issues.
Great, thank you, thank you. Dr. Murphy, as I mentioned in my opening comments and you referenced as well, I was certainly pleased to see that Michigan State University was awarded a $1.9 million grant for the Department of Defense's Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, which will basically develop a toxicity testing framework for PFAS and assess the risk that these chemicals pose to animals. Could you explain the importance of strengthening and expanding research on these dangerous chemicals at the federal level, why we need to continue to do this, and and hopefully, and if we need to continually do it, provide additional resources.
Yes, for sure. We still need to. So these PFAS compounds, they exist not as single entities in the environment. They're mixtures. And so we really don't really have a good handle on, we're starting to get a good handle on two of them, PFAS and PFOA, but there's 5,000 and they're all occurring in these different types of mixtures out there. And so we don't really have good testing frameworks to tackle this complexity. So as a result, and there's a lot of different there's a lot of different standards, and there's a lot of moving targets. So what I think right now is we've been throwing tools at it that we know you work for other contaminants, but so we're getting this really incomplete picture. We're wasting valuable resources and time by duplicating efforts and not developing appropriate tools to handle the PFAS issues. So as a result, we just need, I think we've been tackling some of the low-hanging fruit, and there's a lot more complexity that needs to be addressed. And so in order to do that, we really do need this interdisciplinary approach. We need engineers, social scientists, toxicologists, ecologists, computer scientists, policy expert, risk assessments, and several more. I can't list them all, but we have to be working together with the state and federal partners and with our communities, and also industry, to come up with other solutions. And so this has to be navigated at the federal level. I don't see any other way to do that. So
Yeah, so speak to me a little bit more about that, because clearly you've got a lot of moving pieces here, and you mentioned it has to be interdisciplinary.
yeah,
You have to collaborate to go. We know there are a lot of studies that are out now, which we've heard testimony. Yeah, and it's increasing, the amount's increasing. But correct answer me or this question. I mean, is it, you just feel that there's not a coordination, that some body is saying, we've got 10 studies on this subject, and we're leaving this one behind. We really should maybe do 5 here and 5 there and make sure we're covering the ground. Is that what you're describing?
Yeah,
is
yeah.
that there needs to be?
and it has to be nimble too, so we have to be able to get the new science, coordinate it all, assess it quickly, and then redirect, because we don't know exactly what the main issues are with most of these chemicals.
Who should do that, and how?
The federal government, I think you could, if you created large research opportunities, center hubs that coordinated with, funding opportunities that had mandates to coordinate with the local communities and the federal agencies, and we all have them, but we need a lot of investment in that, because we need all of these other people to sort of switch their focus and get focused in on the PFAS issue so that we can tackle it. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah, sorry.
Mhm. So National Academies of Science, other organizations.
Yeah,
like
something like that would be great.
that would be a great way to vote for.
National Academy of Science would be awesome.
And
Yeah.
I'll have to say, I do have legislation to actually.
That's excellent.
Just saying.
That's great.
That we are addressing that issue, because I certainly appreciate your testimony here. We've heard from the food chains, and Knudsen talked about it as well. We got contaminated cattle, you've got wildlife, the smell. Talk to me more about the food chain. How concerned are you about what's happening in the food chain? Clearly, we've got to do a lot more research.
Yes.
So maybe paint a picture for us a little bit of some of the things that keep you up at night as you think about what could be happening.
A lot keeps me up at night. Anyway, the PFAS.
What keeps you up? Maybe I don't want to get into all of that. Just
No, I mean the PFAS issue I meant.
Oh,
sorry.
okay.
Just thinking about, it was actually, I think long before we started focusing on drinking water here in the US, I think other countries, I think Canada was focusing on the food web and finding it and concern with they were finding, right? And so as a result, they took that information and went to the Stockholm Convention, persistent organic pollution, try to declare some global sort of policy towards these compounds. So yes, I'm very concerned about it, because we just don't know. So as Ms. Knudsen had presented, it's showing up in smelt, for example, and that is not a typical place where we would find large quantities of contaminants, right? So we don't know why it's showing up in smelt in such high levels. Usually we'd find it in something that's a top predator. So we don't know how it's moving. We don't know we don't know how it's bioaccumulating, if there's species-specific differences, or it's the way that they're living or what they're eating about why they're accumulating it. And so as a result, it's just open. We have to throw all sorts of new tools at it that we just don't have right now.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, you noted in your comments that only 2 of the PFAS contaminants have really been studied for decades, PFAS and PFOA, but we know this is a class of chemicals with thousands of those chemicals.
Yeah.
What recommendations would you have as to where we might start to go beyond those 2 chemicals and how we focus?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of effort with the EPA with this ToxCast program and high throughput testing. I think more of that has to be developed specific to PFAS. But it has to be validated, and so it has to be a lot of a lot of investment in actually like seeing if it actually, we have all these cells and receptors and stuff being triggered by PFAS, but does that translate to whole organism responses? Does it translate to whole accumulation in the actual organism? So in order to do that, we need to start to develop new technologies, new instruments and approaches for the PFAS. We're finding it operates a lot differently than most of the typical contaminants. And so we have to cater our instruments to be able to do that.
How does it work differently?
It acts kind of like it's got they have a lot of very different properties, but the thing is, it's got a polar side and a hydrophobic, a hydrophilic side, and it binds to proteins, it inserts itself into membranes, it does all these kind of strange properties. I think it acts kind of like a general messer-upper. It hits a whole bunch of different systems, it doesn't have the single mode of action. So that makes it harder.
Well, I don't like general messer-uppers, so clearly, yeah, we've got to deal with this.
Yeah.
That's the technical term from your scientific background. I
There
know,
you go.
but it explains it very accurately. So thank you for sharing that. Colonel Miner, as a wordsmith veteran, you have a very personal experience, which you've already shared with the committee with the PFAS contamination. To know, to ensure that other service members and their families don't face some of the barriers that you clearly faced in trying to get help and the assistance that you need to get through this very difficult situation you're in.
Well, sure. First off, we've not even arrived at the point to where we can talk about barriers, because I read in a letter from the Air Force, this was past February, that said there's no evidence that anybody drank PFAS water in any real amounts at the base. I read something else that said it's been so long now, it's not even in their blood. It's false on both. And, we wrote a book, obviously, been in the No Defense documentary. We're here today. I've not had one contact with anybody in the Air Force, DOD. Not one call. Not, in matter of fact, is there anybody representing DOD here today? Yeah. So the barrier is that we first have to acknowledge that we exist. And so I would say that if we can get through that barrier, then we can start having meaningful conversations to help other veterans. I do see other veterans that I've heard from Wordsmith. I've read some of their submissions to the VA, for example, and basically they're rebuffed, because it's not a presumptive site. There's a mother may I process, as you know. And so over to you and your colleagues and then DOD to bring, and I'm willing to talk to anybody. I'm probably one of the 3 or 4 people from Wordsmith who actually have all the knowledge, historical knowledge, on how the mechanism of how veterans were contaminated, not only veterans, but our families. Mm-hmm. And not only our families, but unborn children. Not only that, but all the civilians that were working there. And we're talking, I'm sure it's upwards of 50,000 people plus from 1982 to 1997. I know we're all looking forward And I know that, and we're talking about it being in fish and all that kind of stuff. But we got to turn around and look back at the what's left over of that tsunami. And that's actual people that are devastated and are having difficulty. The ones that are still alive, they're having difficulty getting through life. So over.
Mhm. Well, we do. We did have someone from the Department of Defense confirmed to be on the first panel. Unfortunately, last night we found out they had COVID, so they weren't able to attend.
Okay.
But we obviously will continue to work closely with them. We have the Department of Air Force here, as you know, earlier as well. But you're absolutely right. We need to be focused on the past as well. It's an effort we are undergoing right now. We have before the Senate legislation to deal with the toxic burn pits that many of our service members dealt with in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And so unfortunately, it's taken this long to get to where we are, but we're going to make some real positive steps to help those veterans. And we need to do the same with these other substances as well. So this is an important step. Your story is incredibly important. And I'm sad to say there are many stories like yours that are out there as well, but we have to make sure those are heard and then we take quick and effective action. You have my commitment. We're going to continue to do that. Let me just ask you more specifically, what steps forward? Because we have to steps forward to make, but looking back, what would you recommend as ways to better serve veterans and service members and their families? What would you like to see happen?
Well, the first step needs to be the Air Force step up and own what happened on the Cold War battlefield. This is what this is. We need to take care of our people, and the military, our Air Force, the DoD can't step behind the EPA or ATSDR or any other organization to begin to help the veterans that are laying all over the place. And so that'd be the first step. Somehow Air Force or DoD needs to engage the Veterans Administration to, at least at the beginning of this thing, put it on the presumptive list. If we wait for this whole circular process, if we wait for epidemiological studies to ripen to when everybody feels great, we do all those things and the years have passed and no one's left. And so we may as well not bother to have this conversation. We have enough knowledge now to know how bad this chemical is. We wouldn't be here.
Mhm.
Matter of fact, it was so bad that the very chemical that I was exposed to from the firefighter foam was discontinued 20 years ago. They didn't discontinue it, a great profit maker, because all of a sudden it wasn't making money. They did it because they discovered it was hurting people. And when you do epidemiological studies, you need people to actually be harmed by this stuff. And so you cut off the potential for, which is good. We don't want to have people get poisoned by PFAS. All this to say is that the next step, I think, is the VA needs to get engaged. They can come talk to me. I've spent a lot of time with them. I'll share the information that I have. And let's get this on the presumptive list. And then let's get this, just like Camp Lejeune, let's get this on some congressional funding to take care of also the civilians and all the veterans' families, because we know the VA's mechanism is only going to take care of folks like myself.
Mhm.
The burn pit, that happened after the PFAS
Mhm.
poisoning.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And the burn pit was on foreign soil, and Agent Orange was on foreign soil, but this is on American soil. We need to do something.
Yes, no, I totally agree. And Agent Orange was a long struggle, as you know,
Yeah.
and actually this legislation dealing with burn pits also has some additional provisions for Agent Orange, which happened
I
a
saw
real
that.
long time ago. So we need to step up and make sure that we continue to move forward, and we will do everything we can to make that a reality, particularly as people become more aware of the devastating impact that this has on families like yours and others similarly situated.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Oosterbarth, unfortunately, you have also faced this in very close up and personal terms. As a resident of Oscoda, the impact in your family, it's a story that you shared already is incredibly important. Thank you for doing that. But if you could tell the committee about how it's affected your the overall community, you've mentioned that, but if you could tell us a little bit more in detail, people need to put a human face on this crisis. Certainly we have your story and Colonel's stories and others to do it, but it doesn't just impact those directly impacted. It's an entire community one way or another. Could you talk a little bit about the impact on the Oscoda area, whether it's economic, the health issues, clearly environmental issues. There's so many issues. What are the people saying on the ground in Oscoda?
I really appreciate you asking. Thanks. As you might suspect, people think that maybe their property values are affected. We're a tourism city. We have, lakes and rivers surrounding us. It's a beautiful place to be. But we have foam forming on those shores. So it's pretty scary for everyone involved. So those are some of the, I would say, initial reactions. But when you go to your doctor's office and you're told you have cancer, that's when it really hits home.
Right.
So many people in Oscoda in that area are being diagnosed with cancers. And that when that happens, your livelihood is affected, your income is threatened, your daily life is changed. And we live in a rural area. That means we have to travel for miles to receive adequate treatment. And this could go on for months or years even, or a lifetime. So people are hurting because they are dealing with the health issues related to this exposure. That is the bottom line.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've been dealing with the Air Force for a long time. You heard testimony here today about actions that are being taken, but it's been many years. What would you like the Air Force to start doing now?
I appreciate you asking that too. It is very difficult for us as community members to hear once again today that there will be some commitments. We're very doubtful. I mean, if you might be able to understand that we've been at this for a very long time and very little of the promises that were made have come through. So I did think about this a little bit, and the first thing would be to open those portals of information that I had meant that had been talked about earlier with the state. And then expanding opportunities for public input on the plans and responses on that input in a timely manner. For instance, the Department of Defense did engage with the National PFAS Contamination Coalition for some quarterly meetings with some leaders throughout the nation. We posed them questions such that Craig was referencing one of the answers earlier in terms of was that were people drinking out of that well, or were they affected by the PFAS out of that well? Well, that particular meeting, it took them 3 months to answer those questions by those community members. That's not a timely response for community engagement. Now, unfortunately, I suspect the attorneys had to look at all of those responses, because they tread lightly when dealing with us and determining what their answers are. But those sorts of things are what we'd like to see, more readily available, is those responses to our questions. And lastly, and most importantly, we want inclusion of the local leaders at the base closure team meetings, which, by the way, has been done in the past and is allowable through the circular process, but they wouldn't indicate that was the case today. So.
Yeah, we didn't get that commitment today. We got some other
No, we
commitments,
did
but we'll
not.
keep working on that. That doesn't mean we give up. We keep working to move it forward. So when you hear their discussion about communication in the past versus what they promised, well, give me a sense of the past communication, your experience with the Air Force over these last few years in terms of working with the community.
Well, so communication, of course, has been difficult because we have a new site manager about every 2 years. And if you think about how long we've been through this, U.S. Air Force site manager. So it's up to the community members to re-educate the U.S. Air Force every time one comes in. And that is what we've taken on ourselves, and we're trying to be patient with them. But we do have to re-educate them on what the expectations are. And I'd like to just, I guess, explain just a little bit farther. As a community, we stood beside the DOD while the base was in operation, and we continue for them to reciprocate through a shift in how they approach the water crisis. But it is our expectation to be respected for our voices and our stories, and for our real suffering from toxic PFAS contamination, and to be heard and learned from, and from our expertise as residents to be valued. Now, we're fortunate that I think I'm accurate in saying that we have a dream team in Oscoda. We have 2 former site managers working with us. We have multiple attorneys. We have veterans. We have community members that live in the area and have experienced these things. And we can critically look at those plans, and we want to be heard. We have valuable information, and it should be used immediately. And through those remedial investigations, we should have that information, and we should be able to give that feedback, just like John was saying that he noticed.
Right. Well, as we wrap up, I always like to ask folks who've all had the experiences that you've had, if there's one suggestion that you'd want to make to the federal government, this is an opportunity to do that on the record. You have a lot of suggestions. We heard a lot, but it's always a kind of like prioritizing what would be the first thing top of mind that we should know, and we would hopefully be able to act. So I'd like ask, and you can reiterate something someone else says as well. Then I know it's really an issue if I've got more than one person saying this is the number one issue. But what would you like to tell the federal government right now, and on the record in an open forum, that please get this done? This is something that's really important if we're going to deal with this crisis. And we can start wherever. Yes.
Oh, okay. Well,
go ahead,
yes,
Kathy.
if
Go
you
ahead,
don't
Kathy.
mind, I do.
No, I know you want to answer that one, so I'm going to get in there.
There is new leadership in the Department of Defense. And so first and foremost, I'd like them to take the opportunity that will establish the former Wurtsmith Air Force Base as a model, or a kitchen sink project, I think was mentioned today, right? So we have that, they need to take that opportunity at Wurtsmith so that it can be replicated to the hundreds of other military installations throughout the US. And I encourage their efforts to do that. I also want them to monitor and support the health of those affected by the Department of Defense PFAS contamination. Monitor health, get blood tests, regardless of whether we can do anything about it at this point. Get those blood tests like Craig did. And then lastly, create true partnerships with communities, starting fresh, I would say, with an apology from the Department of Defense to communities.
Very good. Good. Whoever wants to be next. Colonel?
Go ahead. Yeah. I would say that quit ghosting your military folks from the past. This contamination happened, and we need to have the federal government step up and do whatever it takes to start taking care of the people that are affected by this. I just want to say that our family, we don't want anything. It's not a thing we want. God is taking care of us exceedingly well. But I know, and I've talked to veterans out there, just amazing struggles that you wouldn't believe. And you look at the struggles that they have, and they line right up with what we already know is PFAS health problems. And they need help. And so that's the one thing. Come talk to me, and let's get this done. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Murphy?
So I would suggest that we would need to coalesce and coordinate our efforts at both the state and federal levels, create research hubs across the country with researchers collected for specific areas. We need to entice researchers with other skills into studying PFAS because we need their expertise to solve the problem. Coordination will allow us to quickly respond to emergency research needs. For example, a contaminated food supply or a farm or drinking water issue. but it would also maintain focus so that we continue to make headway on developing the new tools and technologies and knowledge for these chemicals to find solutions quickly. So we want to be able to have these research clubs, hubs, so that they coordinate and work collaboratively instead of competitively.
Wonderful. Ms. Knudsen.
I would just like to ask that the committee take the time to speak to the other 11 federally recognized sovereign tribes in Michigan. We do work with the federal government on a nation-to-nation basis. Every Indigenous community is unique. But I think you would find that a lot of Indigenous communities in Michigan are facing similar issues with the impedance on our treaty rights for sustenance fishing. Those are real legal issues. So I would encourage you to speak to the other tribes as well.
Very well. Ms. Hendershot.
Thank you. So I think the biggest thing that I'd like to say to the federal government is that the science is going to continue to evolve, but the public needs to know that the polluters are going to be held accountable and their public health is being prioritized with standards to enforce the state and federal, if there becomes federal regulations. How do we do that? Going forward, what I'd like to ask for is that the federal government set up an MPART-like structure. Let the states be a part of that structure. Let the states have a seat at the table with the federal government to discuss these collaboration and coordination issues that are going to directly affect the states. And I'd also like to be a part of the conversations as they go to set standards, because these are very complicated, complex issues that have broad-reaching effects. Setting a CERCLA designation is going to have far-reaching effects for many of our sites in the state, as well as other cleanup efforts. And so we really need to be a part of those conversations. And so I would ask that we be able to participate and have a seat at the table with the federal agencies as they go to set up this new structure.
Very good.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you. And thank you to all of our witnesses. Thank you for your testimony here today and for contributing to today's discussion. Clearly, it's a discussion we're going to continue to have for months and years in the future, and your active involvement really will make a difference. So thank you for that. It's clear that the scope and the scale of the PFAS contamination here in Michigan, as well as across the country, is going to require a whole of government approach. And fully addressing this problem will require both the federal level. We're going to have both interagency, intergovernmental cooperation, and the information that we got here today will be essential for us to get that effective policy response. Be rest assured that what I've learned here today will go back to Washington, D.C. Will inform legislation that we have before us in the Senate now, and we'll hopefully move through the full Congress, as well as others that will be drafted. It's also about pushing our federal agencies to keep working hard and to create the sense of urgency with them that this crisis demands, as we've heard here loud and clear. But we will not give up. We're going to keep the fight. The people in our communities deserve the attention of the full force of the federal government and our government to address this issue. The record for this hearing is going to remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on August 16th, 2022 for the submission of statements and questions of the record. I will be entering into the record PFAS contamination at the former Wordsmith Air Force Base. The true story will be entered into the official record. With that, this hearing is now adjourned.